Anxiety and stress, two things that many of us struggle with, whether it's at work or school or at home. And while it's something that's being talked about more and more, it's usually about how to cope with anxiety. So, what lies at the root of the problem? Here to help us understand is Dr. Doug Tatarin, clinical psychologist and life coach. Good morning.
Good morning, Nadia.
Now, it feels like we're living in a time where people are experiencing more anxiety and stress, or at least we're talking about it more. What's going on?
Well, our culture has gotten, I think, in many ways more complicated than it used to be. And we're still bringing an older set of values, an older way of approaching these complications. And I don't think it's a good match. So one of the things that I've been looking at is that what is going on with anxiety? What is going on with stress? And there's kind of two answers to that. One of them is really complicated, and it talks about the changes in our culture in the last 100 years and the evolution of values and complexity. And that's actually probably a little bit too much to get into right now. And maybe we can talk about that in the future. The simpler answer comes back to what I spoke about, I think, last time I was here, which is that our culture basically is suffering from something I call alexithymia. And what that means is that we don't do a good job of putting words to emotions and feelings, and particularly to the point where we don't resolve them. So what happened somewhere in the 40s and 50s is that psychology went through what we called the behavioral revolution, and it wanted to get more scientific, and we started really looking at observables. And if you think about stress and anxiety, that's kind of what's going on, is that we have, so this is the simple answer. The simple answer is that what are the symptoms of anxiety, right? If we think about them, I actually looked up on the Mayo Clinic, what are the symptoms of anxiety? And there's 15 of them listed. 14 of them basically have to do with the body. So listen to the symptoms: feeling nervous, restless or tense, increased heart rate, breathing rapidly, sweating, trembling, feeling weak, trouble sleeping, gastrointestinal complaints. Those are all symptoms of emotional activation. Okay? So when we're talking about anxiety, we're actually teaching people to pay attention to the symptoms of anxiety, symptoms of emotional activation, without telling them they're having emotions. And so we're trying to treat the symptoms instead of addressing the underlying cause, which is that you're emotionally activated. How do you actually resolve your emotional activation? And once you approach anxiety and stress like that, you have a whole other way of looking at it.
So let's look now at the roots of anxiety. You're saying these come from emotional indicators. Like what's happening here when we experience anxiety or stress?
Well, essentially what's happening is that we're being emotionally triggered, right? And we're having an emotional response, but we haven't been taught to look at it that way. We haven't been taught to say, oh, I'm having an anxiety attack, right? What am I feeling that's making me emotionally upset? What we've been taught is like, oh, geez, my hands are sweaty, my heart's racing, I need to cope with this. I need to calm down. It's really hard to override the emotional system. It really wants to express itself and work things out, right? And that's what we need to do whenever we get stressed out, right, or anxious, is we have to ask ourselves, what am I feeling and why am I reacting like this?
So imagine someone's going through some kind of anxiety attack or they're feeling it. What steps? Talk us through the steps of what we can ask ourselves to kind of get to the root of the problem.
Yeah, the idea of what are we feeling, I actually posted on Facebook yesterday. This is Easter holidays, right? And what's going on is we have a lot of family gatherings happening. And I asked people, how are you feeling about your family gatherings? What's it bringing up? And a lot of people were stressed by it, right? A lot of people were having anxiety over it. And I asked them to list what was going on. And it was really interesting. People were waiting for someone to blow, right? Waiting for the fight to happen. A lot of it was kind of cross-generational, where the kids would be in conflict with the parents or the grandparents. And that actually speaks a little bit to the value stuff that I was talking about. But regardless of where it's coming from, it's an issue of communication, right? There's something unresolved. So if you're thinking about going to dinner today with the family and you're not like looking forward to a good meal and having a good time, that means you're bringing something from the past with you, right? And these people, your family, because they know us such a long time, are probably triggering you. And so the question becomes when you start like getting stressed out or anxious about it, you have to say, well, what's not resolved for me in this relationship with that person? What am I carrying with me from the past, right? So I don't know if we can maybe find an example to work with if you want to pull something out.
Sure. So let's do one home example, one work example. If you go into a family dinner or a family get together and say there's resentment amongst a family member, or maybe it's a sibling, what kind of process, what are the steps or the questions to ask yourself to get to deal with that?
Okay, so if you're resenting somebody, that means that that's a really good indication you're carrying something from the past. They did something in the past to hurt you. And so before you can talk to someone about why you're upset, which is really the only way to resolve it, you have to have a clear idea of what's going on inside you. And that's the challenging part. So the first thing that I recommend is that people sit down and imagine the worst case scenario, right? So imagine you're sitting in your imagination, you're sitting at the table and you say something and somebody completely ignores you and changes the topic, and that's your trigger. And you have to just sit there and go, okay, what am I feeling? Right? And it might be I'm feeling ignored. It might be that I'm feeling dismissed. It might be that I'm feeling rejected. It's going to be different for different people. And the way you find the right word is you try out different words. You imagine the scenario, and you know you're imagining it because your body gets activated. And then when you find the right word, it's going to increase that emotional activation. It's like when I say, I felt dismissed by him, you'll get this like, you'll get often angry. But anger is usually a distraction from the fact that you're being hurt by the person. If someone dismisses you, they're actually hurting you. And so don't get carried away with the anger. Come back to how are they hurting me? And so if it's like, I feel dismissed, just see if that captures all the dynamics between you and him or you and her. And maybe it's like, no, I feel dismissed and rejected. And maybe those two words capture all the dynamics. So once you've got that, now you can actually come up to the person or catch it in real time and say, no, excuse me, this is really important, I'd like to say it. And then maybe when you're alone with the person, you can say, there's this thing that happens between us all the time where I offer something to the family and you just override it, and I feel dismissed by you, and I don't like that, and I'd like to talk about what's going on. Now, that's a level of maturity and conversation and communication that most people don't have. And that's because we're not taught how to communicate about these kinds of complex issues. And the first thing you need to do is, what are you feeling, so that you can go to them with that issue.
It's interesting because I think we don't, one thing like you mentioned, we don't know the vocabulary, we don't know the process, but sometimes we are uncomfortable about what that realization can lead to. So if you're feeling, especially sadness, and people are reluctant to show that, and what often comes out of sadness is tears and crying. What's the power of crying?
Well, crying is just the natural expression of being hurt emotionally. It's just the most natural thing to do. And in a healthy environment, when you cry, the people who are loving you, or supposed to be loving you, are supposed to have empathy and want to understand and support you. Now, it doesn't mean that what you're feeling is true, right? Just because you're feeling it doesn't mean the person's actually dismissing and rejecting you, because they might be in a whole other world with a whole other dynamic. But you won't be able to address that. And if you come up to the person open and vulnerably and talk about feeling dismissed and rejected, hopefully they'll go, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. Let's talk about it, right? And the crying lets them know that you're in a state of vulnerability and that you want that kind of depth of relationship with them. And hopefully they're going to also want that and be in that space, honor that space in a good way, so that you can both end up bonding and feeling closer to each other.
It's something we're so reluctant to do, though. Are there benefits to crying, like psychologically, physiologically?
We touched on this a little bit last time, but yes, your body, if you're getting activated all the time and you're not expressing it, then you're going to get physiological symptoms of stress. You'll get the chronic stomach activation. Maybe you're going to be going to the washroom a lot. Maybe your hands will be cold all the time, which is a sign of chronic fear activation. You don't want to keep your body stuck in a state of chronic emotional activation, because it's just long-term not healthy for it. The other term for chronic emotional activation is stress, right? And we know from Hans Selye's work that there are 3 stages of stress: the initial phase, the adaptation phase, and then the exhaustion phase. If you stay with chronic emotional activation too long, you literally get fatigued. Your body's been running at 10,000 RPM for too long, and it needs the break, because stress and emotions were part of our survival adaptations, and they keep the body running at too high a level for a long-term thing. They're just supposed to come, be experienced, and released and go. So we'll get a physiological reduction in stress by crying. And if you're crying and sharing your feelings, you're going to end up bonding. We release chemicals that make us feel close to the other people that are there when we're vulnerable and crying, right? And so we'll end up feeling better about our relationships, feeling understood, and feeling connected and cared for.
Another space where many people face anxiety and stress is in the workplace. So I'm wondering if we could do another example of a situation where someone may be feeling anxiety in the workplace and what they can do about it. So in this case, perhaps if there's a workplace bully or someone in the workspace that intimidates other people, what would be the kind of steps to take or the questions to ask ourselves around that?
Okay, that's a really interesting dynamic, because bullies have a whole dance of their own. And if you notice, most bullies treat different people differently, right? And that's because some people engage in that dance with them more than others. So if you've got a tendency towards not being really assertive and kind of being meek or shy, bullies can hone in on that. And they tend to learn your triggers. So they'll know where to touch to get you in particular. And the best defense against that is for you to kind of clear out your triggers. And so if someone's treating you a certain way and you're reacting in a particular way, but your colleagues or coworkers aren't, you have to ask, well, what am I bringing to the equation that's unique to me? Because if I can find out what my emotional activation is and start clearing it, and they can't trigger me, then I'm not going to fall into that dance with them. Now, bullies in general tend to make people feel inferior, right? They intimidate and make you feel small and inferior. So you have to kind of ask yourself, what's going on with me? Why aren't I able to assert myself? Why aren't I able to stand up to them? Because most of this stuff is pretty subtle. And if you just change the emotional, energetic dynamics, it'll go away often. Or you'll at least be able to address it in a straightforward, non-combative way. But the first question becomes, what do they make me feel? And this is likely going to be triggering us at what I call a core feeling level. So we talked about the interpersonal feelings, like feeling dismissed and rejected. Now, if I'm feeling intimidated by the bully and inferior, I'm going to have some core feelings like maybe I feel insignificant, or I feel inadequate, or I feel worthless. They don't have to be true, but they're just feelings I have. And so I react to that kind of dynamic dance by getting small and being pushed around. So if I can sort of find the right words, like I feel insignificant, right? I feel insignificant. And you say it and you find your body getting activated. Usually there'll be times in your past that will come up. And you'll get taken back to that time in kindergarten when you tried to stand up for yourself, but everybody swamped you. And then you just like got basically this deep feeling of helplessness and insignificance that no matter how hard I try, no one will ever hear me. And so you've just brought that kind of feeling belief into the world with you. And so when other people don't hear you and treat you that way, you just fall back into that place. So if you want to get free of that dynamic, you need to go back to that initial impression and process it. Usually that means crying. And somewhere in there, it kind of lets something shifts and you see it all differently and your emotional system updates. And now you're no longer intimidated by that kind of dance or dynamic anymore.
Is it that simple? Like it's just doing this exercise and then all of a sudden you're not going to have anxiety on Monday when you go to work?
It often is. Like that's what's so amazing about looking at anxiety and stress this way is that for decades and decades we've been taught to cope with it. But as soon as you look at it through the lens of emotions and feelings, you've got this whole other dynamic and approach that you can take to resolving it. But when you say, is it that simple? Our culture's not ready for this, really, because how often do we cry and explicitly find the feelings that are going on interpersonally and at a core level so that we can resolve them? But once you learn those feelings and those processes, it can be that simple. I've literally had people come to see me who have had like 10, 20, 30 years of an anxiety disorder. And once they approach it this way, there's a whole other set of tools they can use for resolving it. They learn this thing, they start expressing their feelings and emotions, they go through the period of crying and getting rid of their triggers, and suddenly their anxiety just isn't there in the same way. They don't get triggered.
If you are in the throes of an anxiety attack or you're deeply stressful, is it too late at that point to have this conversation with yourself if you're not even able to think clearly?
Well, if you can't think clearly, then yeah, it's like trying to learn to meditate when you're really, really stressed out. It's best to learn that before you're really stressed out. But at the same time, when you're activated, it's really a good time to ask yourself, what am I feeling? Because your body's got all this energy and you need to like name it and express it so it can be released properly.
What's the next conversation to have on anxiety, given that, it does seem so prevalent right now? What do we need to be doing to deal with this kind of, it's almost plaguing so many of us in all different ages as well?
Well, I think what we really do need is to shift the way we see anxiety. For like I said, for the decades, we've kind of taken it from the behavioral perspective, and that's like looking at the symptoms and coping with it. Once we start owning our inner experiences and trying to deal with it as an emotional activation that we haven't resolved, we just see the whole world differently. And once our culture can start teaching this to our kids and look at our relationships in this way, I think it'll just give us a whole new way of understanding and a whole set of empowerment to approach anxiety and stress.
Dr. Taran, thank you so much for this conversation.
It's been wonderful, and I look forward to more with you.
Dr. Taran is a clinical psychologist and life coach. Check out his website, bioemotiveframework.com.